Imagine discovering that one of Hollywood's most unforgettable true stories was only part of the truth. Behind Rocky Dennis's extraordinary courage was a mother far more rebellious, complicated, and unapologetic than the movie ever showed. And before her death, Rusty Dennis spoke openly about her son, her choices, the night she lost him, and the Hollywood version of their lives. Some of what she revealed challenged the story audiences thought they already knew. And once you hear her own words, Mask may never feel quite the same again. What if I told you that the real Rusty Dennis, Rocky's infamous mom, sat down before her death and revealed things about her son, her life, and that movie that absolutely nobody was prepared to hear? Today, we're talking about Roy Lee Rocky Dennis, his mother Rusty, and what she revealed about the truth behind the legend. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, before the movie, before Cher, and before any of it happened. Because if you really want to understand what Rusty eventually said, you first have to understand what this family was actually living through. Roy Lee Dennis, nicknamed Rocky because as a baby he wouldn't sleep unless someone rocked him, was born on December 4, 1961, in Glendora, California, to Florence Rusty Tullis and her second husband, Roy Dennis. When Rocky was still a very young child, he suffered from frequent ear and sinus infections. There was nothing catastrophic about them at first. He simply seemed like a sickly kid. Then, when he was around 2 years old, he went in for a tonsillectomy, and that was when everything changed. During the procedure, an X-ray technologist noticed that something appeared to be wrong with the boy's skull. What followed was nearly an entire year of visits to UCLA Medical Center, multiple times every week, until doctors finally delivered the diagnosis: craniodiaphyseal dysplasia. 2 words that changed absolutely everything. The disease was so incredibly rare that in 1965, when Rusty was first told about it, doctors reportedly said that only 6 other cases had ever been recorded in all of medical history. 6 cases in the entire world. The condition causes abnormal calcium deposits to build up in the skull. The bones thicken, continue growing, and push outward, distorting the face while compressing the brain and progressively damaging vision, hearing, and neurological function. It was slow, relentless, and devastating. The doctors gave Rusty the prognosis without softening it. They told her that her son would become blind, would likely be intellectually disabled, and would be dead before he reached 7 years old. Dead at 7. But there was something important about Rusty Dennis. She didn't fold. She didn't retreat into grief or simply accept what she had been told. Instead, she looked at those doctors and essentially told them that she would see about that. And the story of how she went on to raise Rocky, and what she later said about everything before she died, is the story we're actually here to tell. This was where Rusty truly demonstrated exactly what kind of mother she was. She refused to allow institutions to simply write her son off. While the family was living in Covina and Glendora, she continually pushed doctors and schools to treat Rocky like any other child. When doctors claimed his eyesight was too poor for him to read, Rusty dismissed the idea. When schools attempted to remove him from mainstream classes, she fought back. She later told people that she believed the resistance wasn't really about Rocky's intelligence, which she firmly insisted was intact, but instead about the discomfort felt by other parents. And Rocky proved her right. His warmth, personality, and humor made a powerful impression on screenwriter Anna Hamilton Phelan when she encountered him during a visit to UCLA's Center for Genetic Research. Phelan later explained that Rusty certainly wasn't conventional, but she was exactly the kind of mother Rocky needed. Yet before we get to what Rusty eventually revealed, there's another question you have to ask yourself. Who exactly was this woman? Because the version of Rusty that Cher played on screen was the polished version. The real Rusty was something else entirely. To really understand Florence Rusty Tullis, née Steinberg, you have to look beyond the leather jacket and the Hollywood portrayal, because the real woman was considerably more complicated, and arguably far more fascinating, than anything a movie script could completely contain. Rusty was born in Brooklyn, New York, on May 29, 1936. Her father worked as a truck driver. She was Jewish, raised in Brooklyn, and sharp-tongued from an early age. At 13 years old, she was kicked out of junior high school for truancy. By 14, she was smoking marijuana and running around with motorcycle gangs. At 15, she dropped out of school completely and found work as a hoochie-coochie dancer at Coney Island. She wasn't even old enough to have a learner's permit to drive a car. At 17, Rusty married her first husband, a truck driver named Tommy Mason. A year or 2 afterward, their son Joshua was born. Eventually, that marriage fell apart, and Rusty moved back in with her parents. Then came her second marriage, this time to Roy Dennis, followed by a move to California. And in 1961, Rocky was born. By the time doctors diagnosed Rocky, Rusty had already constructed much of her personal philosophy around one central belief: that if you believed strongly enough, you could make yourself well. She told interviewers that early in her life she had decided that if a person could make themselves sick, then that same person could also make themselves well. That conviction became part of the way she raised Rocky. Whenever he suffered a headache, and whenever his pain flared up, she would send him to his room and tell him to make himself well. Was that empowering? Rocky's extraordinary spirit certainly suggests that it may have been. But as we'll eventually get to, it was also a philosophy that carried a shadow with it. There was another side of Rusty's life that the film cleverly showed, but still softened. Rusty was a full member of the Turks, a motorcycle gang. These weren't people dressing up and pretending to be bikers. They were rough, hard-living individuals who had created their own world around fierce loyalty and blunt expressions of love. And they absolutely adored Rocky. The movie character Gar, portrayed by Sam Elliott, was based on a real man named Bernie Tullis, Rusty's partner. The entire biker circle surrounding Rocky wasn't simply Hollywood set dressing added to make the story more colorful. These people were his family. Then there was Rusty's drug use, something she discussed with a directness that the movie never quite managed to capture. During interviews, Rusty pushed back against the way the film framed that part of her life. The movie suggested that she used drugs because she was struggling, overwhelmed, and emotionally drowning under the circumstances surrounding her son. Rusty herself didn't accept that interpretation. She said she partied all the time and drugs were part of the partying lifestyle. In her telling, this wasn't simply a woman in pain desperately reaching for a crutch. This was a woman who partied hard and openly owned that fact. And that distinction mattered enormously to her. So what happens when a woman like this, a biker, a drug user, a school dropout, and an intensely unconventional yet fiercely protective mother, finally faces the cameras after her son is gone? What does she actually say when people begin turning the most painful and extraordinary chapters of her life into entertainment? Because what Rusty eventually said about the film, about Rocky, and especially about the night her son died, is where the story becomes far more complicated than the Hollywood version audiences remember. By 1985, Mask was playing in theaters across America. Directed by Peter Bogdanovich and starring Cher as Rusty and Eric Stoltz as Rocky, the film grossed over $48,230,000 at the box office, while Rusty Dennis had been paid only $15,000 for the film rights. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. $48 million at the box office, and $15,000 to the woman whose life, and whose dead son's life, made it all possible. But here's what makes that $15,000 even more complicated. According to the Mask Wikipedia entry and multiple interviews, most of that money went directly toward paying medical bills for her older son, Joshua, who at that time was undergoing treatment for AIDS. Rusty didn't sell Rocky's story for profit. She sold it to keep another son alive. When the movie came out, reporters descended on Rusty expecting gratitude. Maybe some tears, perhaps even some gracious Hollywood praise. What they got instead was something far more interesting. She called the film a fairy tale. Not a tribute or a beautiful memorial to her son, a fairy tale. Those were her words. According to the Chicago Tribune's 1986 profile of her, Rusty said, "I always thought showing Rocky's courage would help a lot of disabled kids and the parents of disabled kids. Sometimes they are more disabled than their kids. I didn't realize the movie would be about me, too. Thanks to Cher's brilliance, I come off a kind of heroine." Read that carefully. She wasn't bitter about Cher's performance. She actually praised it. What she couldn't fully square was the shift in focus. She had imagined a film about Rocky's extraordinary courage. What she got instead was a film that split the spotlight, turning her into a central character, a complicated, glamorous anti-heroine, when she had only ever thought of herself as his mother. On Cher specifically, Rusty was actually generous. She told the same Chicago Tribune reporter, "Cher depicted the way I am very well. I always thought I was perfectly normal, that the rest of the world is nuts." That line, "the rest of the world is nuts," is as good a distillation of who Rusty Dennis was as anything else on record. The Chicago Tribune also confirmed the two biggest factual departures from reality that Rusty pointed out. First, the film compressed a decade plus of events into what looks like about a year. Second, and this is the one that clearly stung, her older son Joshua doesn't appear in the film at all. He was simply written out of Rocky's story. Then there was the music. Rocky Dennis loved Bruce Springsteen. He was a devoted fan, and director Peter Bogdanovich built the entire original soundtrack around Springsteen's songs. But Universal Pictures couldn't reach a deal with Springsteen's label, Columbia Records, and quietly swapped the music for Bob Seger tracks without telling Bogdanovich. Rusty was not pleased. In a 1985 appearance on the San Francisco talk show People Are Talking, she said flatly, "I don't think Rocky even knew who Bob Seger was." That's a precise, devastating quote, and it was all she needed to say. Bogdanovich was so enraged that he sued Universal for $19 million, claiming the music was swapped in violation of his final cut privilege. The Springsteen songs were eventually restored for the 2004 director's cut DVD, 20 years after Rocky's story first reached theaters. But here's what really nobody talks about. Because all of that, the money, the music, the fairy tale, that's complicated. What Rusty said about the night Rocky actually died, that hits different entirely. By September 1978, Rocky's health had declined sharply. He was 16 years old, and the disease that should have killed him before age 7 had finally begun to win. He was in a wheelchair during the final weeks, and the headaches that had been his constant companion his entire life had escalated to a level that nothing could touch. On October 3, September 1978, the family, Rocky, Rusty, and the biker circle around them, went out to a restaurant for dinner. Everyone could see how weak he had become. That evening, Rocky came home with a headache. Rusty did what she had always done throughout his entire life. She sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. He never woke up. Rocky Dennis died the following morning, October 3, September 1978, at home in his sleep. He was 16 years old, nearly 17. He had outlived his death sentence by nearly a decade. Now, the movie shows Rusty discovering his body herself in a raw and devastating scene. In reality, at the time of Rocky's death, Rusty was not at home. She was at her lawyer's office dealing with a drug possession charge. Her partner Bernie, the real-life Gar, called to tell her. That gap between movie and reality matters not because it makes Rusty a bad mother, but because it reveals how much Hollywood smoothed the edges of an already jagged story. And there's something Rusty said about her parenting philosophy. The make-yourself-well approach she had applied to Rocky from infancy, that deserves to be examined without editorial spin. She never publicly described it as a failure or framed it as guilt. That characterization would be putting words in her mouth. What she did say, plainly and repeatedly, was that she believed in it completely. Whether that philosophy also meant Rocky's pain was sometimes minimized, that is something only Rocky and Rusty knew. What the record confirms is that she never backed away from it, never apologized for it, and believed to the end that it had given Rocky something invaluable, the refusal to see himself as dying. But to fully understand Rusty Dennis, you have to understand Joshua. Because the brother the movie erased is the key to understanding almost everything else, including why she sold Rocky's story in the first place. Joshua Mason was Rusty's first son, and Hollywood erased him from Mask. That omission reportedly bothered her. In 1985, Joshua was a writer in San Francisco. A year later, he was diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma, the cancer widely associated with AIDS during the mid-1980s crisis. He was openly gay and described his mother as supportive, though she hoped for grandchildren and once suggested a sperm bank. Joshua died in 1987 at 32. Rusty had now lost both sons. According to Mask Records, most of the film rights money she received went toward Joshua's medical bills. She sold one son's story to try to save the other. In a Chicago Tribune interview, she once said, "Joshua doesn't believe in dying. And neither do I." And so, by the time it was Rusty's turn to face the end, what did she leave behind? What did this defiant, complicated, impossible woman say when the clock was running out? After Rocky died, Rusty relocated to San Francisco, where she embraced Buddhism and began working as a counselor to help drug addicts. Around the time the film was released, she was also planning to work with the Shawnee Project, a workshop supporting terminally ill people, including AIDS patients. The woman whose life had once been almost entirely defined by chaos was, by 1985, beginning to build something much quieter. Yet one part of her never changed. She continued riding motorcycles. On October 14, 2006, Rusty, who was then going by Florence Tullis, was riding her three-wheel motorcycle when its right tire fell off. She lost control, the bike hit a curb, and her body was thrown into a telephone pole. What makes the aftermath especially harrowing is that, at first, no one knew what had happened. Her friends and family remained unaware until they noticed a brief item in the San Gabriel Valley Tribune about an unidentified 70-year-old woman who had been injured in a motorcycle accident. They connected the dots and went to her. Rusty had suffered 2 broken legs and a punctured lung. She survived the initial accident. She was Rusty Dennis, of course she did. But the infection that followed became the one thing she could not fight off. Florence Rusty Tullis died on November 11, 2006, at Beverly Hospital in Montebello, California. She was 70 years old. Right up until her death, she never stopped being exactly the person she had always been. Speaking about Rocky's death, she said it was just another place to go, and he loved going places. She also said that death was something she and Joshua simply did not believe in. Rusty never asked, "Why me?" Not once, not for Rocky, not for Joshua, and not for herself. A Chicago Tribune profile from 1986 described her as a 49-year-old Jewish mother, former drug addict, go-go girl and Shackley Products distributor, who lived in a good housekeeping neat biker crash pad in San Francisco's ethnic Mission District, alongside one nephew and 3 bikers named Pelican, Lenny, and Steve. It remains one of the great character portraits in American journalism because it sounds absurd, yet it is completely real, and somehow it explains everything. And so, with all of that now on the table, the mess, the truth, and the gaps separating the movie from reality, what does it actually mean? Here is what the verified record reveals when the Hollywood gloss is stripped away. Rocky Dennis lived for 16 years, nearly 17, with a disease that should have taken his life before he was even able to read. Yet he lived those years with wit, warmth, and a complete refusal to let his appearance define who he was. After beginning academically behind, he graduated from Sandburg Junior High as an honor student. He was elected best buddy, most good-natured and friendliest camper. He tutored his classmates for $3 an hour, and he negotiated that rate himself. He memorized the night sky. At summer camp, he fell in love with a blind girl who could not see his face, but somehow saw everything else about him. When his doctor offered surgery that could correct his features, Rocky responded with a question. "Who will I see in the mirror if I change my face?" He chose his face. His mother, meanwhile, was a Brooklyn-born biker with a drug habit, a truancy record, and an unwavering conviction that it was the world, not her son, that was broken. And she was right. She confronted school principals who attempted to push Rocky into special education. She berated doctors who tried to confine his future within timelines. Around him, she created a family made up of rough, fiercely loyal people who loved him without conditions. Every day, she reminded him that he was not a victim. And yes, on the final night of Rocky's life, she told him to go to his room and make himself well. But that was something she had told him throughout his entire life. And throughout his entire life, he had tried. Anna Hamilton Phelan, the screenwriter who wrote Mask, summed it up simply. This was not the PDA Mother of the Year, but she was the perfect mother for Rocky. Whether you interpret that statement as a compliment, a complication, or both is entirely up to you. The facts remain what they are. Rocky Dennis died at home, peacefully in his sleep, without machines, without a hospital, and without indignity. His mother had promised him exactly that, and she kept her promise. Rusty Dennis died in November 2006 at the age of 70. She died much the same way she had lived, moving on her own terms, seemingly unable to stop. If you were expecting a tidy ending, a clean redemption arc, or one final moment of perfect maternal grace, Rusty Dennis was never going to give you that. What she gave instead was something harder, messier, and more real. The truth, exactly as complicated as it actually was. And now you know. Drop a comment below. Did you know any of this before today? Because most people didn't. Like and subscribe if this blew your mind, because we've got more real stories behind Hollywood's favorite myths coming every single week.